For those of you who are just joining us, I'd like to welcome you to a conversation that has started on Wednesday evening, just kind of been ongoing. And by conversation, I mean it's really a conversation. This is a time where we're wanting, as we're gathered together around these tables, for us to speak to one another, to wrestle with questions and with Scripture. We have mics that are going to be roving, and we really are going to be incorporating times where we want to hear each other talk, right? So this time, the way I'm conceptualizing it is a community that is gathered around Scripture, around each other, and through it, the Spirit is going to speak to us. Something you might say, or something through somebody at your table might say. So welcome. So those of you who are joining us tonight, what have you gotten yourself into? What are we talking about, right? What is deconstructing Jesus? Sounds dangerous and disrespectful. All right, so to bring you up to speed, an illustration, a version of a story I shared on Wednesday evening. The TV show, I think it's a Penn and Teller show again, and it's one of these gag shows where they trick somebody into stepping into a scenario. They really have no idea what they're getting themselves into. And this time, what's happened is they've set up a restaurant, which they have advertised as being a newly opened restaurant in the city, and they invite a fairly prominent food critic from the local paper to come and review the food. And they have a waiter. They have dressed up in a tuxedo, greeting the food critic as he comes in. And the food critic is told that he's going to sample the dessert at this restaurant, something off the dessert menu. And the food critic is like, yes, I'll be glad to give you my expert opinion. So they tell the food critic that what he's going to enjoy that evening is the world's finest whipped white Belgian chocolate. Okay? And so here's the gag, is that what it really is, and the camera goes to the back of the kitchen, is some guy that I think runs the camera on the TV show, taking Cool Whip. And this is not even the real Cool Whip. It's like generic, like Publix Cool Whip or something like this. And he is just kind of like flicking it onto the plate, okay? And the waiter kind of wipes it up on this nice china dish and takes it out to the food critic and asks him to sample, I guess, whipped white chocolate, okay? And so the gag is now the food critic is, got his little silver spoon, and he puts the Cool Whip into his mouth and just slowly lets it kind of dissolve on his tongue. His eyes roll back, okay? And, and the waiter's like, well, what do you think? And the food critic, exquisite, okay? The best thing I've ever tasted, heavenly, all right? Okay, so what does this have to do with the theme? What we're doing these meetings as we gather together is we're asking the question, is it possible that we, just as this food critic, comes in, expects to get one thing, and gets what he's expecting? Is it possible that we do this ourselves and that we do it with Jesus? Is it possible that the Jesus that we love, that we follow, the Jesus that we hold at a distance, or maybe even reject, is not the real Jesus, but the Jesus that we have constructed out of the expectations and desires, the assumptions that we make? So what we've been doing as we gather together is we've been considering that possibility and looking at fundamental assumptions that shape the way we think about everything, that shape the way we read the Bible, they shape the way that we think about Jesus. And we're asking the question, is it possible that we've gotten some of those assumptions wrong? It's difficult and uncomfortable to ask a question like that, but it's important if you care about the truth. Right, so the first night, Wednesday night, we talked about our assumptions of the truth, and we talked about the story about Jesus healing a blind man twice, and how this illustrates the situation that many people, all people actually, I think Mark is telling us, find themselves in, even followers of Jesus. We've left everything. We follow Jesus. We call him the Messiah, but just like Peter, we don't like what the Messiah says he's going to do, where he's leading us. We have selective hearing, right? So there's this tension of seeing but not seeing, of needing healing and needing to learn. Last night, we talked about the kingdom of God and what Jesus talked about, and what Jesus might have meant when he said the kingdom of heaven is near, and how that might mean that the kingdom is not off in some far-off place in some distant time, like I think a lot of people think, but somehow the kingdom is very near to us, breaking into our lives, calling us to respond. So it's a third meeting. We're continuing the conversation, and we are considering yet another fundamental assumption that once again shapes the way we think about everything. So, a string of questions I'd like you to consider, and we'll test these mics to see if they work. Okay, so I'm going to give you 3 scenarios, and I want you to talk about them at your tables, and then we'll see what you come up with, and then we'll test these mics out to see how they work. Okay, scenario number 1. The Atlanta Braves are facing the New York Yankees in the World Series. Yes, Yankees or Braves? Yankees, okay, all right, here we go. Here's the question, this is a scenario, here's the question. The owners and players and managers and fans on both sides are in deep prayer, okay? They're in deep prayer for victory, all right? Scenario number 1. Scenario number 2, Nation A is at war with Nation B. The leaders and citizens of Nation A are praying for the conquest of Nation B. The leaders and citizens of Nation B are praying for the conquest of Nation A, all right? All right, scenario 3, we'll bring it a little closer. Church X and Y are holding evangelistic meetings. The pastors and members of Church X are praying for the conversion of Church Y, and the pastors and members of Church Y are praying for the conversion of Church X. All right? So, let's get the discussion started here. Here's the question I'd like you to consider. Whose side is Jesus really on? All right, so to simplify the options, I think it's going to be some variant of this to guide your discussion. You can either say Jesus is on side X, side Y, Yankees or Braves. You can say Jesus is on both sides, somehow. You can say Jesus is on neither side, or you could say other. Okay, and if you go other, you have to explain what the other is, all right? Or maybe you'll have some really creative answer, and if you do, that's okay too. So take a few moments to talk about this, and then we'll gather back around to see what you came up with. All right, let's see what some of you have answered this question. So we got some mics that are roving. So if you have a spokesperson at your table that wants to share, maybe you could choose one of these scenarios: the baseball scenario, the war scenario, or the evangelism scenario, and share your answer to the question. All right? Any volunteers? Just raise your hand. Don't be shy. Okay, over here.
All right. Hey, mics are working, all right.
Yeah, mics are working. Very good.
The first thing you said was that the Yankees got to go. So then, just kidding. Yankees are great. All right. We came to the conclusion of other. The reason why we chose other is we started talking about examples from the Bible where God did technically choose sides and give some victory and give some defeat. And so we said that his side is his purpose.
Okay.
Not necessarily what we're choosing, what we think he should choose or what we're praying for, but his side is the purpose that fits his will at that time.
Okay. So the other is God's will. So whatever God's will. Okay. Yes, on the couch.
We had a couple answers here. My answer was other, because you didn't give us enough information about each scenario to make a situational analysis of what Jesus would do.
Okay. So what are some of the factors that need to be considered?
Pardon me?
What would be some of the factors that need to be considered to help the decision be easier to come to?
Well, you need more information about each of the scenarios and the people involved and the exact situations involved.
Okay.
or things like that.
All right, so not enough
He
information.
says neither side, that Jesus is on his own side, kind of like what they were saying.
Okay.
And that's what Chris says.
Okay.
So.
Jesus on his own team. Yeah, yes, so let's do two more. So one in the back, and then I guess this table over here.
Do I go?
Yeah, we'll go over here, and then we'll go over there. So.
We said that God doesn't necessarily pick a side, but he's for everybody. He's not going to go against somebody, and he's not going to cause two groups to conflict against each other in that sort of sense. God's will play out in the end.
Okay.
He knows what's best for us, and he sees the future, and he knows what should happen and what will happen.
Okay.
And even though prayers can conflict, I feel like in the end, God will show his will, and everything will work out.
Okay. God's will prevail. All right, one more answer over here. So,
I was thinking kind of that, that it would be C, he's on both sides, because he says that he'll never leave us nor forsake us.
okay.
And so he's not going to, leave the people on either side. So that's kind of my train of thought.
So he's on both sides, but will he answer the requests of both sides? So Jesus he will never leave either side. But whose prayers is he going to eventually answer?
Okay, here we go. And when it comes to, well, we kind of decided, look at C, but I was thinking other, because when it comes to him answering the prayer is not, sometimes what we kind of look at it as is kind of like a formula to just get what we want. Prayer is talking to God like a friend.
Okay.
And because of that, when it comes to answering the prayer, he wants us to talk to him so that in our own minds, we can kind of begin to think about what we're saying and what we're asking. And he works with our own hearts in our talking to him, and then our minds become more clear on what his will is and what he's thinking in the situation as we compare with his word. So it's kind of like he answers you by you just talking to him and letting your heart be moved by him.
So if the people were really praying on both sides, maybe God would somehow, through that process, change everyone on both sides? So as you're talking to God as a friend, is that what you're suggesting?
You said changing everyone?
It's what?
You said changing everyone through the process?
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Good. Thanks. All right. So obviously, the questions in this scenario I'm setting up is a little simplistic, a little rhetorical. Try to get you to think a little bit. Would the detail help if I said that you played on one of the teams, or you lived in one of those countries, or you were members at one of those churches? Maybe that wasn't the missing detail, right? Because if we add that detail, and this is the assumption that I'm wanting us to think about, the answer, I think, becomes clear. Jesus is on our side. Right? I've had a reoccurring thought recently that this is probably not the case. I want very much for Jesus to be on my side. And so tonight, what I want you to do is to convince me that this reoccurring thought that I've been having is wrong. Right? Now, you're like, that's crazy. Of course Jesus is on your side. Well, I don't know. Let's look at the passage. Every night we've been looking in Mark so far this week. So I want to consider another story in the Gospel of Mark, and let's wrestle with it together. Mark chapter 2, 13 through 17. If you don't have your Bible, we have the text up on the screen, like we do every night. Matthew 2, 13 through 17. I'll just read that out loud. Once again, Jesus went out beside the lake. A large crowd came to him, and he began to teach them. As he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," Jesus told him, and Levi got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. When the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with the sinners and tax collectors, they asked his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said to them, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have come not to call the righteous, but sinners." So last night, we talked about Jesus' calling of the first four who were fishermen. So tonight, we learned that Jesus likes tax collectors too. That's, I guess, the second group of people that he's hanging out with and calling. And this, if you understand what tax collectors did, just like his selection of fishermen to be his first students, should raise some eyebrows. Okay, so let's talk about tax collectors a little bit, unpack a little bit of the context. In the first century in Judea, there's two ways you could pay taxes, or two kinds of taxes. There's direct taxes that you pay directly to the government, land tax, head tax, okay? And there's indirect taxes like sales tax, customs taxes, taxes you pay for traveling on certain roads, right? And it seems, if you read the passage here very briefly, that Levi belonged to this second kind of taxing system, the indirect tax, right? So he's got this little booth, which seems to indicate that he's a toll collector. So he's sitting at a booth, and it might be something else, but people walk by, and if they're gonna travel further, they pay the tax. That's how I envision it. It might be something else. So tax collectors, as you might imagine, are despised by everybody else in society. Now, this is not hard to imagine, right? 2 months and some of us pay taxes. Maybe for the first time, some of us, right? You pay Uncle Sam, IRS sends you a letter, you might owe, okay? And at that moment, how are you feeling toward Uncle Sam and the IRS? This evil empire, why are you taking my money? Okay, now so think about this. So in Judea, you have the nation of Israel being occupied by a foreign power, the Empire of Rome. And they come around and collect taxes from you. You don't like the taxes, it's not even going to your own government, okay? But there are other reasons you don't like tax collectors. First of all, these tax collectors who are Jewish are in contact with Gentiles, people who are not Jewish. And they're exchanging money and meeting together and eating together and exchanging, shady exchanges, right? You shouldn't hang out with Gentiles, and these tax collectors are, right? So they're kind of dirty. Secondly, they're traitors. They're meeting with Gentiles, and then they come back and they tax their country people. And lastly, this is probably the worst part of it, is they're dishonest. So frequently, these tax collectors, how they would make money is they would charge more than what the Roman government required, and then they would take the skimming and pocket it, right? So a lot of tax collectors were very wealthy, and they were getting wealthy because they were dishonest. Now, so Jesus surprisingly does something that he did with the fishermen. He sees Levi, and he says, "Levi, I would like you to follow me." And by this, he means, I would like you to be my student, or I would like you to be part of the kingdom of heaven that's breaking into the world. And so Levi, it seems, is ecstatically happy to receive this invitation. He gets up, leaves his tax collector booth, just like the first fishermen disciples left their boats to follow Jesus. And he does something else, because maybe he's got money and he can do this. He throws a huge party. He throws a huge party and he invites all his friends, and all his friends are also tax collectors. And the way that Mark describes it is, he says they're sinners. Okay, it's tax collectors and sinners. Okay, so what is he talking about when he talks about sinners? Let's talk about this a little bit. Okay, because we're going to try to apply this to our context. Generally, the term sinner could apply to two broad groups of people. One is, in the Old Testament, people who lived immoral lifestyles. So you might be somebody who's murdered somebody, you are a thief, so you've robbed, or you're an adulterer. So that's the first kind of sinner. Very similar to maybe the way we would use the word. And then secondly, you have people who engaged in dishonorable trades or vocations that defile them. Okay, so a pig farmer would be this kind of person, because pigs are unclean, right? And you have pig farmers, and they're belonging to this class. Janitors, maybe, okay? people working with body fluids all the time. So the Pharisees would use this term sinner as a blanket term to refer to people who failed to live by the ritual law, which is what they followed, and they call these people in a derogatory term, the people of the land, so it's translated, these common people, people of ill repute. And so you get the idea here that what Jesus is doing as he starts his ministry is he is calling them to be a part of his movement, and he is not just calling them to be a part of his movement, he is hanging out with them, eating with them, okay? And this is what the religious leaders are offended by. Jesus is breaking bread with the common people, the people of ill repute, the sinners and the tax collectors. And apparently, I don't know, maybe he looks like he's having a good time. Because the reputation he earns, Matthew tells us by doing this, is that, what does Matthew say that people say about Jesus? He's a glutton. It's Matthew 11:19. He's a drunk. And he is a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Now, I think if you've got a reputation for being a drunkard and a glutton and a friend of sinners and tax collectors, this seems to be indicative, to me, of repeated behavior by Jesus and his followers, right? So this is not something that happens once with Levi, but maybe Jesus has a habit of frequently going out and hanging out with the common people. Doesn't Jesus care about his reputation? Why does he eat with sinners and tax collectors? That's exactly what the Pharisees asked, the question they asked in Mark 2:16. There's good theological reason for them to ask this question too, because there are texts in the Old Testament. You read them, they're quite clear. There are certain people that you should not associate with. They are unclean. Right? Jesus claims to be a rabbi, and he is hanging out with these people. Right? What is wrong with Jesus? But Jesus seems to be largely unconcerned about the fact that his first followers are fishermen or tax collectors or sinners or hanging out at these parties. In fact, if you look at the pattern of Jesus' ministry, he seems to just keep adding on to the list, okay? So, diseased people, let's go touch them, right? Poor people, let's feed them. We'll have a huge party. We'll have put everybody out on the lawn and we'll just throw a big lawn party, okay? One class of people I think is fascinating to contrast Jesus' treatment of compared to everybody else is women. Now, this may not seem very shocking today, but Jesus treated women very differently than everybody else. Let's talk about this for a little bit. I think this is fascinating. So what I want to do is I want to ask the question, eventually I want to get to, if Jesus is hanging out with these people and they're outsiders, what do outsiders look like today? That's where I want to go. Okay, so before we go there, let's talk about Jesus' treatment of women. All right, just architecture speaks a lot of people's attitudes. All right, so the temple in Jerusalem, where Jesus seemed to have only gone once in his whole ministry, all right, or maybe twice, is built in a way where there are these different courts, and there is one court in the temple called the woman's court. Okay? And this is considered to be the least sacred area of the temple. And the women were allowed to go there. Right? And then after the women's court, there was the man's court, the court of the Israelites. So I guess women weren't Israelites. Right? So there's the court of the Israelites, and only men could go there. And then there's the court of the priests, and then finally there's a temple, okay, where the priests can go in, or the high priests on special occasions. Okay, so the courts were laid out to separate women as far as possible from the inner precinct. So the court of the women is the furthest away from the temple. So you take that, and then you look at the way Jesus does his ministry. Right? So here's just an overview of some of the things that we read. We know that Jesus had no problem teaching women. Luke says that Mary sat at his feet. That's Luke 10:38 through 42. Mark 5:25 through 34 says he ignores ritual impurity laws regarding women. There's a woman who is suffering menstrual bleeding for 12 years. She touches Jesus, and instead of leaping away and saying, "Why are you touching me?" He says, you are a daughter of Abraham, where he commends her for her faith. Jesus talks to foreign women, John 4, 7, 5 through 30. It's a long conversation with her. His disciples are shocked. Why are you talking with this woman? He's got no problem with it. He uses terminology that treats women to be equal to men. Luke 13:16, he refers to a woman as a daughter of Abraham, which occurs nowhere else in the Bible, because Abraham has sons. Okay? So there's lots of other passages where Jesus is willing to offend Jewish male sensitivities of the day by overthrowing various mores and customs regarding women. Women touching his feet with perfume, not a problem, okay, in public. So he accepts women into his inner circle, and it would appear that half of his closest followers were women. So Jesus was unique among Jewish males in his era. The pastor who shared this information with me, Pastor Charles Swan, is a Presbyterian pastor in Canton. He says, Jesus was a liberated man. That's what he said. So thank you, Pastor Charles Swan. All right, so fishermen, tax collectors, sinners, women, the sick, the poor, children, right? Jesus' ministry consistently shows preference to the outsider. And I would suggest to you that if Jesus were around today, that it'd probably be the same. He would want to hang out with the outsiders. All right, so good news. Jesus loves outsiders and wants to hang out with the outsiders. It's good news if you're an outsider. So this is where my problem comes in. I think about my life, and I'd like to think I'm an outsider, but I don't know if I'm an outsider. I don't know if I fit into any of these categories here. Obviously, I'm not a woman. Some of you fit into that category. Maybe some of you fit into this category, but I don't know. You're here at camp meeting, so I don't think you fit into the category here either. That says a lot that you're here at camp meeting on Friday night. You're religious insiders. Okay? Most of us, I mean, I'm guessing a lot here, but I think most of us run in socially respectable circles. Most of us, even though we think we're not wealthy, have a place to sleep. We drove here in a car. And so compared to the rest of the world, we're very wealthy. The plight of women? I don't know, still a long way to go. But still outsiders when it comes to the overall picture? Women outsiders? Maybe, maybe not. The scary thing is, I think this is just a trend that you notice, is that outsiders eventually become insiders. So even if you were once on the outside, eventually if you hang out at church long enough, you become an insider. I was just writing an email this week talking about a young adult in my church. And I realized that the person I was talking about was in their mid-30s and had kids, had a kid. And I caught myself while I was writing this email. I was like, is that still a young adult? Right? Like, at what point do you stop becoming a young adult? Now I realize that, am I still a young adult? I'm not sure if I am either. Right? And so like, I grew up for a long time thinking like, the adults. And they're against the young adults, and so the young adults are the outsiders. But the young adults, once they start hanging around the church long enough, guess what? You're now one of the hated adults, okay? And it is your church. Okay, so in the video today, I'll quote this and then I want to turn the question over to you. Chris Say says, if you believe the Bible, then you look at this place. He's standing in the middle of a big dump. And you look at the people who live on this trash dump and you believe that Jesus is here in a way that he is not in other places. Okay, so Jesus technically is everywhere because the Spirit is everywhere, yes. But I really resonate with the way Say puts it. Jesus is in some places and with some people in a way that he is not in other places. And Jesus shows up in unexpected places and with unexpected people. And I think those kinds of people we could very loosely refer to as the outsider. Okay? So here's the question that I'd like us to wrestle with now for the next 5 minutes or so. Who is the outsider today. If Jesus were here today, who would he be eating with? Where would he be hanging out? Right, and I'd like you, as you're thinking about this, try to be as specific as possible. Think about what you're watching in the news, the kinds of people that are in the news, people in your own life, okay? People in your community, maybe where you live, and ask the question, if Jesus were around, where would he be and who would he be hanging out with in light of the passage that we just read? I got a little silly question here that you could also try to ask if you have the time to think about it. Would Jesus be at camp meeting? All right. So 5 minutes, okay? Talk about it, and then we'll come back together and see what the Spirit says. Okay. All right, so I'm eager to hear this. All right, so we're trying to make it practical. Outsiders today. Who's the outsider? Mike? You got, this table over here. Okay.
Okay, well, we talk about the fact that Jesus would not have been a traditional Christian, so therefore he tended to do things very differently. So he would probably be feeding the homeless and visiting the widows, the hospitals and stuff. But then we brought it back to the fact that if the church is considered the place where sinners come, and Jesus is a friend and a lover of sinners, then he would definitely be at camp meeting with us and attending to our needs.
Are there sinners at camp meeting? I'm not sure. Okay, so this is a good point. If the church is full of sinners, Jesus would be with the church in the way that he is with the sinners and tax collectors in this story. Yes. So the question is, yes, then are the sinners that Jesus is with, are they in fact in the church? Ah, that's good. Anybody else? What would they go back here? All right.
Romans 5:6 says, "For while we were still weak at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly." I would say Christ will be out in the world.
Okay.
He'll be with the homosexuals. He'll be with the drug dealers. He'll be with the people from other faiths. He'll be reaching out to them because salvation is just not for, the righteous, for the ungodly. And probably Christ will be at camp meeting maybe during Sabbath because his custom was.
So Jesus is here on Friday and Saturday, but probably the rest of the week he's out in the world. That's nice. Okay, thanks, Gabe.
But he'll probably skip the VM, probably.
So yeah, that's good. Okay, anyone else here? Okay, so we got out in the world with several of the communities that you said the gay community, you said drug dealers. What was the third one? People of other faiths, okay? So people of different faiths, okay? Good. All right, do we have a couple others? Okay, back up here, yes, all right.
Well, we talked about some of the same groups that they talked about as well, and also like the pedophiles, people that we don't like to associate with, and people and the prostitutes and people of that group. And when you talked about being an outsider, I thought of it in a spiritual sense as, that you're the spiritual insiders, the Christian lingo, and the outsiders don't. And the group one group that I thought of was like celebrities, because they have that party lifestyle that, we obviously can tell it's very, very secular, even when they ascribe to a certain religious beliefs. So that was one group as well that we discussed.
So you could be somebody who is affluent, powerful, famous, and still be an outsider in one sense, you're saying? Okay. Yeah.
We had a few on our list. We had the handicap. We put homosexuals as well. Impoverished, drug addicts, single moms. There's sometimes you can tell they're kind of singled out.
Okay.
And some people with maybe some wild tattoos or piercings some people may look at them as, they're doing something wrong or that's not too cool. So, I mean, that could be labeled as an outsider. And some other religious fanatics that some people want to stay away from. I'm not naming anybody, but you know what I mean.
So wait a minute, so you're saying that the street preacher that you see on campus or on the street, Jesus might be with them in a certain kind of way that maybe he's not with us.
You can, some people probably even figure, if you're door knocking, they can probably think you're a religious fanatic as well. Not using you as generically.
Yeah, not me personally, thank
generically
you. Okay.
speaking. And we had prisoners.
Okay.
Because, there's some people that have, done wrong and he'll come with them and they'll repent. And so that's what we got.
Okay, good, thank you. We got one more over here? Yeah, let's do this and then we'll move on.
Can I ask a question to your question?
Yes.
Actually, it's for everybody else. It's
Yes.
listening to lists, and we had our own list about different people that Jesus would hang out with. How many of us are actually doing that?
All right.
I gotta ask, we put it out there as a list, and I just think that how many of us are actually being the hands and feet of Jesus to people who are not for any other reason, just loving them, just befriending them, not because we're doing a check mark or because it's a Sabbath afternoon activity or just because it's the thing to do if we're to be like Jesus.
Yeah, so I'm glad you raised this question because, are we ready to go there? You guys want to go there? We'll go? All right, let's go. Or do we want to have one more comment before we go there? All right, we got one more comment here.
We add politicians and sick people to the list of other.
So sorry, I didn't.
Politicians.
Politicians.
And sick people.
Okay.
Sick people from the
He's
hospital.
with the sick and with the politics. Yeah. A lot of times I think we think politics is the most godless place in society. I think a lot of people think that. Hollywood and politics. And now we're saying that maybe God is there too. Okay, so let's go back to this question of Jesus would be in church if there were sinners in church. This is one way of talking about this. Are the people that we just all mentioned, okay? Are they in church or are they not? Okay, that's one way we could ask the question. Are they welcome? Why aren't the people that Jesus is with actually in church? That's one way you could ask the question. The other question is if we know where Jesus is in a special way, with all these people that we've mentioned, okay? Why aren't we there? Okay, so three questions that I really want to wrestle with this tonight. So I'm glad you raised the question here. Let's go to the next slide, the next sets of questions. What are some of the things that prevents the church from being where Jesus is? Okay? And so we'll bring it home. We could talk about the church institutionally. You can talk about your church. And then the question I think you're getting at here, which is what is it that prevents us, you and me, from being where we profess Jesus is? Right? And what can we do to get there? That's what I'm wrestling with when I wrestle with this idea of, maybe Jesus is not on my side and he's somewhere else. Right? And my role is not to say, Jesus, I want you on my side, and keep praying, Jesus, come to my side, come to my side. But my job is to say, Jesus, give me the courage to get on your side. Give me the courage to go where you are and be there with you. Okay? So these are big questions. So wrestle with any three of those. Maybe all three, if you have the time. We'll take 5 minutes to do that. All right, this is where rubber meets the road, where we start talking about why aren't we there and what do we need to get there. Anyone want to start us off?
Even if you become comfortable hanging out with people who are not of our faith who are not Adventist, I think there's another major challenge that still stands in the way. You know, because in my situation, I hang out mostly with people who are not Adventist. That's not really the challenge that I find. The challenge that I find is to do what Jesus did. You're not going to get a lot of applause for that. And hanging out with cool, interesting, exciting people who are not Adventist is not much of a sacrifice. Hanging out with influential, powerful people who can maybe help you or teach you or whatever, that's not much of a sacrifice. It's hanging out, it's the daily, sacrifice of serving people in ways that go unnoticed. That's the practice of Christ that I think is the hardest for us. And we don't applaud that type of sacrifice in the church, and that's not applauded outside the church either. But that's where Jesus was in the places where he wasn't going to get thanked. And I think we like getting thanked.
There's a story. I wish that they could be here tonight. Actually, Rusty and his wife Stacy, two friends of mine, they're actually tomorrow speaking at my church because I'm here. I asked if they'd speak, but I wish they were here tonight because they have this absolutely amazing story of actually doing something about what we're talking about here tonight. And some of you know Rusty and Stacy. I got permission to talk about them, so I'm not talking about them behind their back. But about 4 years ago, Rusty and Stacy were living pretty normal lives. Rusty was a physical trainer. He and Stacy have 3 boys together. And about 4 years ago, a little over 4 years ago, they did something really strange. They moved their family onto the other side of the tracks. So they lived in Buckhead in Atlanta, which is a really nice area of town. And they moved to an area that was economically challenged. That's what people would call it. Section 8 housing. And they did it on purpose. All right, this is a zip code where there's the highest rates of addiction, crime, child abuse, abandoned housing, and displaced people. That's what Rusty says. He was interviewed, by the way, in Adventist Review. I know all of you read that regularly. I know it because I'm friends with Rusty and I Googled it. And then this is what Rusty says in the interview. I want to share it with you. It challenges me and inspires me at the same time. He says, "Our pasts certainly aren't without blemish. If you had asked me 10 years ago what we would be doing for Christ, I would have laughed you out of the room. Stacy and I both came from dysfunctional families that suffered from addiction and alcoholism, and until we accepted help for our addictions and isms, we only had 3 choices in life: jails, institutions, or death. Stacy has had an autoimmune disease since she was 16, and I've battled mental disease since about the same age. We have a blended family. There's 4 boys, not 3, one of which we never get to see. At one point in Stacy's life, she was lying on a sidewalk with someone sticking a shotgun in her face. There was a point in my life, even when I was clean and sober, I was chasing people in cars and threatening them. We were not the kind of people that got invited to upstanding places." So he's a physical trainer. He's living in Buckhead, and he's got a checkered history, you could say. I think Rusty would call it a checkered history. And he moves his family to this other part of Atlanta. And then the question becomes, well, why? This is what he says. He says, I'm going to quote him directly. "God has called all believers to weave into other lives of faith a genuine concern for the least of these. When I discovered this, I searched the Bible and spirit of prophecy to see if it were true. And I was absolutely floored by my findings. Caught up in conversations about what people should eat or wear, we have totally failed to notice that people are starving, naked, and hurting just down the street." So this is what Stacy and Rusty do now with their life. It's kind of like a summary of their week. "Everything we do is with an eye to bless our neighbors and our community. If I'm taking our boys rock climbing, I'm taking the neighborhood kids. If I'm tutoring the boys in math, then we're tutoring kids from the neighborhood. If I pray at my meals, then we've got people over and they pray too. I have a young people's group called 555 that I started because I caught a bunch of kids smoking. We take camping trips, climbing trips, air shows, carriage rides, and visits to the country. This past summer, I was a pool monitor for our apartment. This September, Stacy handed out cucumbers for a few days and taught neighbor women out in the gazebo how to make bruschetta. And there are literally thousands of interactions we have had with people in our neighborhood, all because we were willing to be intentional with our time and hang out. So if you read this interview, there's a whole long list of things they're doing. They're part of this neighborhood. They moved in. This is really exciting. This is what Rusty's going to be sharing with my community, my home community tomorrow. Recently, Rusty's apartment manager from this apartment complex he's been living in moved to another apartment complex to manage it. And she called Rusty and said, Rusty, do you know of any other family that is like yours that will come and live in this apartment complex and do what you do? I will give them free rent. Right? So Rusty is now in this place where he is looking for people to come, and he's placing people in apartments to live and hang out with the people that live in those apartments. And Bill, you know Rusty, does he have more than one? He's looking for 26 teams, because I guess the apartment wants to franchise Rusty, right? To go out and live in these apartments. And that's what Rusty's looking for people to do it. So I look at Rusty and I look at Stacy, and I'm awed by who they are. I am challenged by who they are. And I think about what is God calling me to do in my life to be where Jesus is. Because powerful things happen when people go where Jesus is, when the church goes where Jesus is. The world starts to change. So is Jesus on my side? Is he on your side? Nick's going to come up and sing a song as we reflect on that, but before he does, I just want to, close with one last text. It's the closing text of this passage for us to be reflecting on too. It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. So how might Jesus be calling you and me to get where the sickness is?